Morning, and thank you all for attending GHY's webinar on trade and tariffs in 2025, preparing your business for what's next. This session is going to cover some actionable insights and strategies to navigate the evolving trade landscape. I'm going to open up by sharing a current best practice flow in general terms. Then I'm going to turn it over to Lenny, who's going to talk about what's going to happen or could happen post-inauguration, what might be possible, when it might be possible, and how it could be possible. Colleen is then going to share the current state of sureties and the roles and responsibilities of the importer within that program. We're encouraging everybody to submit
there's
their...
probably like a bunch of other people on this.
Yeah.
How do I make it full screen?
Maria, can you kill the sound with everybody but us, please?
Yeah, for sure. If you can, I'm just going to go through. If everyone can make sure that their audio and video is off, that would be good. But I'll just go through and make sure everybody's.
Thanks so much. So, we encourage everybody to submit their questions throughout the webinar as we go through. And should time permit at the end, we're going to address them in a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, but it will end promptly at the 1 hour mark. We're delighted to welcome these two distinguished guests to this session. We are joined by Lenny Feldman. He's the managing partner at Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg. ST&R, as they're known, is the premier leader in navigating complexities of global trade. And in his spare time, he's actually the general counsel for the National Customs Brokers Association and Forwarders Association of America. He's got a diverse background, including co-chairing the Commercial Customs Operations Advisory Committee, known as COAC, on critical trade issues. So we're very appreciative of his time here today. We also have Colleen Clarke. She's the Senior Vice President of Surety and Trade at Roanoke. Managing risks with surety has been really put to the test since the last administration, through COVID, and as we look into the future horizon. And Colleen and her team are market leaders in this space. Well, I'm Dewar, and I'm a member of GHY's leadership team. And before I kick it off to Colleen and Lenny, I'm going to share a little bit of the general process flow for context. What you see here is the role of a customs broker as well as an importer. A customs broker is on your behalf, the importer's behalf, is responsible for release. They're responsible for the entry summary and accounting, notifying importers of their payment obligations, and importers are responsible for payment. It's not unlike how things work with your accountants. Your accountant, well, they file returns, they do audits, they provide advice, but they don't pay your taxes. However, for decades, a portion of the trade community that has been subject to low or no duty, particularly on Canadian and Mexican goods, may still be paying their broker their duty obligation versus paying CBP direct. We're anticipating all importers will be looking to maximize their cash flow, anticipating tariffs being introduced, and even after this change, all the reporting, all the controls, they're going to remain the same as you see within this process flow. To initiate this change, importers merely need to have a U.S. bank with NACHA capabilities, and GHY, we welcome the opportunity to support importers after this webinar, positioning to maximize their cash flow by deferring payment to the very last possible moment. Without further delay, with that as a bit of an opening as to the current flow and where we want to see or support importers in the future flow going, we're going to turn it over to Lenny. With that, Lenny, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Alan, and thank you, GHY, for having me today. And of course, I appreciate all of you for joining us and listening to what we have to say about the shifting trade landscape and what to possibly expect in 2025. It's here, folks. It's only 2 weeks away, so it's really time to start thinking about what's ahead. And I've been referring to this fondly as the 3 Ps. You have to prognosticate a little bit and really start thinking what's ahead for you and your company in the years to come, especially 2025 in this new administration. You have to prepare. You have to get ready for the challenges that are ahead and be ready to make those changes. And you have to persevere. And as they say, when it comes to perseverance, I think a good quote is, a best offense is a good defense. Now, that being said, that adage is usually applied to the gridiron. It's usually applied to sporting events, which we know and love in the US and Canada. It also refers to military combat. Military combat, I mentioned, well, this is a trade war that's been going on with China, and I dare to say the trade war is about to get exacerbated over the next few months. The president is going to be very interested in going in that direction. So if we go to the next slide, I'd like to launch into some of the materials I have. And usually the first question I get is, well, can the president unilaterally impose any of the tariffs that he has been mentioning, whether it was during the campaign or now during the transitionary time period? And we know that there have been some promises about increasing tariffs on imported goods. The answer is yes, as you see in this comedic strip here, this political satire. Don't those look so yummy, these tariff pods? Yes, the president can actually do this through executive action or executive order. Next slide, please. And what do these tariffs potentially mean? What can be the ceiling on these tariffs? Well, China is an area that you're really going to need to focus. If you're involved with China, you need to really start looking at your strategy there. As I mentioned, you have to prepare, you have to be ready to persevere, or potentially look to alternatives, because there could be an additional 60 to 100% tariff on goods from China. In addition, there could be a revocation of China's permanent normal trade relation status, or most favored nations tariff. That's the typical tariff that is in play, but that might be changed. It might be aligned with the tariffs required from Cuba or from North Korea, which are 50, 60, 70%. And again, folks, this is on top of the trade remedy tariff that we've been dealing with, that 15, that 25%. So it really could get high in China very quickly. There could be a blanket tariff, 10 to 20%, on goods from all countries potentially under certain statutes. 100% tariffs on countries that abandon the dollar as their reserve currency. So that would be specific to certain countries, and some countries where you might not suspect a trade war, but it's more of a financial type play or interest. 25 to 75% on Mexico or Canada, which I know is important to a lot of you participating today. We've heard the rhetoric. It could start at 5, 10%. It could go up. And we're going to have to see what happens with Canada and who's going to be the prime minister, who's going to be the leadership, what's going to be their position on everything from immigration and fentanyl, and cooperating with, quote unquote, the demands, the requirements of our administration and of our president-elect, where that's become even more of a wild card this week. And look, let's take a look at automobiles as well. Any of you involved with autos or auto parts, especially from the South, from Mexico, that really could be up for grabs, potentially looking at 100%. Next slide, please. So a lot of people ask, well, does the Constitution grant controls of tariffs to Congress? Isn't this a congressional lawmaker issue? Well, it kind of was, but over the years, there have been measures passed and laws passed that grant authority to the president to take unilateral action on the tariffs. So with the next slide, let's start to take a look at what some of these potential tariffs could look like in a little bit more detail. The first one I want to go over is the Trade Act of 1974. This is one that could be very powerful, and for various reasons, and there are various sections that could, to an extent, wreak havoc and really change the playing field for those of you that are importing across the globe from any types of sourcing countries. There's section 122, which provides for up to a 15% tariff, as well as quantitative restriction. So even if you are willing to pay the tariff, you might not even be able to get it in, or even both, for 150 days if we have a trade deficit. So under 122, the ability to pose that tariff is for 150 days, but there's no investigation needed. All the president would need to do is to look at the trade balances technically to figure out who has a deficit or a surplus. And if there's a deficit, this 15% tariff could be levied for up to 150 days with potential quantitative restrictions. Pretty powerful, right? Section 201. Section 201 is a vehicle for the president to impose duties or other trade measures on products if the International Trade Commission conducts an investigation, determines a surge in imports is a substantial threat of serious injury to a U.S. industry. You're going to see a lot about protecting domestics, bringing the trade, bringing the business, I should say, back into the United States. Now, Section 201, you may be familiar with it if you deal with solar cells, if you deal with washing machines. There was talk about blueberries that came and gone, has come and gone. So it's generally limited to specific products. This is more of a product-specific tariff than a country-type specific tariff like the 122 or the 301 I've been talking about, although 301 is a little bit of both. On 201, you're going to find that these products normally might be covered by anti-dumping and countervailing duties. So this is kind of adding insult to the quote-unquote injury, so to speak, for importers, because there's going to be those additional 201s that could be levied. And it's looked upon in a way, instead of going, as I mentioned, after country to country, and what I like to call it the game of whack-a-mole, do we go after this country or that one or this one? It's commodities across the board, typically whatever the country might be. So this allows to hit multiple countries at the same time. However, the good news, if you want some good news, I do have a little bit here and there, is that it does require a lengthy investigation. So this one might not be as fast and furious as some of the others. Section 301, that is one, if we stay on the slide, thank you, one more minute. 301 is an important one I want to go over under the Trade Act of 1974. This allows the president to impose tariffs, quotas, or other actions against foreign countries that carry out discriminatory practices against the U.S. China, 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 and China. They've really been the subject of 301 over the Trump administration 1.0, the Biden administration, and we expect it to still be an avenue of tariffs for Trump 2.0, so to speak. As you know, the focus has been China. As a result, an investigation would not be needed in order to increase tariffs on China if the government wants to do that. There are, if some of you are participating, and I would encourage all of you to consider participating in the 301 lawsuit litigation, there were just hearings at the Court of Appeals Federal Circuit this week. And we learned that there were some very interesting arguments that were raised on both sides. And the argument is against the level 3 and 4 tariffs, those tranches, to argue that they were not appropriate, they were not lawful, not constitutional. There wasn't a right under the law to expand the tariffs, the investigation beyond, especially if this was an intellectual property right investigation and issues that were threatening U.S. industry, as opposed to just going back and forth in a retaliatory way. We'll have to see if there's any success when we hear about 3 to 6 months from now what the result is. However, China still is, again, very big on the chopping block here, but other countries, if it was to be added, would require an investigation. So those countries could be safe, at least for the time being. Let's please go to the next slide. The other ones I'd like to talk about are 338. This is an interesting one under the Tariff Act of 1930. Here, the president could assess duties up to 50% on any country if found to be discriminating against U.S. commerce or even ban the imports. But the president also could take similar action on a third country if they are benefiting due to the original 338. So hypothetically, 338 action, president says 50% because we feel that China is discriminating against U.S. commerce. As a result, we see a surge of imports, legitimate manufacture going to Cambodia or Vietnam. They, in fact, are benefiting because now people are transitioning away from China to Southeast Asia. They then could be subject to the 338 and the 15% because they were beneficiaries of the 338 being levied against China to begin with. So this kind of has a cascading effect. This could be interesting. It could, as I mentioned, have some far-reaching effects. And it is possible that it could be relatively quickly implemented because there would just need to be a determination that there's discrimination against countries by way of China or other trade partners, so-called trade partners. Very interesting opportunity there for the president-elect. 232, you've heard of those, the tariffs and the quotas, steel and aluminum. Those tariffs are already in place. However, there's normally an investigation required first. We're not aware of tariff limitations here. Those tariffs could go up, that's possible, but it does require investigation as well. So this is something that might not happen as quickly. Next slide. and this is going to be kind of a catch-all. I mentioned, I'm going to start with the bottom, the permanent normal trade relations status. That's one, again, where I mentioned the president could revoke the normal tariff rate status, most favored nation, column one, especially for China. It is going to require congressional action. There would need a bill and law passed to do that. So that could take time, but there could be an appetite for that. And there have been draft bills putting that exact type of situation in play. But the one I want to draw your attention to is a more imminent threat, is the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. There's the wartime provision and there's the peacetime provision, the IEPA, International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. This grants virtually all trade powers to the president. If he declares there are threats to our national security, foreign policy, or the economy, which really wouldn't be that difficult for the president-elect to declare, to indicate that there are those threats. As a result, this could happen relatively quickly. We understand that under the National Emergency Act, if the president issues a proclamation announcing that there's an emergency, publishes it, notifies Congress, they're good to go. The action takes place. So it could happen on day one. It could be announced on day one. It could be published the next day, and notification goes to Congress, and boom, we are having these tariffs, these potential, if you will, barriers in place quite quickly. So that's kind of a run through of what could be happening in the crystal ball as we try to prognosticate what those possibilities are. And if you go to my next slide, you're going to see that we put together a handy dandy chart for you all, which kind of assesses again, and this is not legal advice, folks. This is prognostication, but at least setting forth what the legal provisions are. The Trade Act 74, the tariffs for 15%, doesn't require investigation, could see a high likelihood of use there. Trade Act of 74, Section 301, what we've seen from China, requires investigation, not from China though. So that could be high and could be a way to hit China very hard, very quickly. I mentioned the IEPA, the all-encompassing virtually all trade powers to the president, no investigation, kind of likely that he could use this. The others become more possible, not necessarily as likely. The 50% duties and the ban in those third countries that are benefiting from the first one, who is facing the 50%, but no investigation required. The Trade Expansion Act, the 232, steel and aluminum, you do need investigation. So we'll take a look on that. We'll see what happens with China and their most favored nation status tariffs. And of course, there's the 201, which does require investigation, not necessarily expecting those. So that's your chart to kind of pull it all together. I will add one thing before we go to the other, one or two things before we go to the other side as to what can you do to avoid and mitigate these tariffs. First off, as Alan was mentioning, we're talking very high stakes here. We're talking duties that are going to come fast and furious. We were just speaking with Customs yesterday, by the way, folks, and the lag time from the, if you will, executive action or order being issued for Customs pretty much needing to get this through, get the right tariff numbers in play for your broker like GHY to actually have the software now in place with all of these flagged for tariffs. They need at least 2 weeks, 4 weeks even better for them, but about 2 weeks to go through the direction of the White House, the U.S. Trade Representative, Commerce, because remember, they could be directed. CBP is directed. They will not be making these decisions. They're on the receiving end, the way we are, to be directed to implement, execute these tariffs. About 2 weeks, 4 weeks for it to really work, although it could be required quicker. So it could happen, in a short period of time, but that ACH option, making sure that you are in an electronic situation, ready for that payment, good to go, would be so critical for all of you. And I really would encourage all of you to consider that, number one. Number two, just another aspect to this, despite what's in front of us here on this chart, and I want you all to consider it very carefully, see how it could impact your business. We are hearing some rumblings that maybe the focus from the Trump administration 2.0 will be with regard to key sectors. What are the types of commodities that they want to bring back manufactured to the United States? Defense, industrial type machinery or equipment, whether it's steel, iron, aluminum, copper. Those could be pretty much, high in the chopping block for higher tariffs. Critical medical supplies, syringes, needles, vials, pharma, type materials. Those could be included as well. And how about energy production? That is something you hear about, that they want to bring that to the United States. That would mean batteries, rare earth minerals, solar panels. So if I've named any types of commodities just now, those key sectors, you need to be acutely aware that those actually could be targeted if, in fact, the administration says, well, maybe we won't paint with such a broad brush, but we want to be more focused and surgical, if you will, as to the types of commodities. I'm hearing a little bit about that, so I just wanted to throw that out there. With that, let's go to the second part of my presentation, please. Just wanted to briefly discuss the ideas as to how to reduce duty in this new trade environment. We know about this fundamental shift, going away from China, discouraging China trade. You need to diversify. A lot of you have been doing that already. You're going to have to continue to do that. Looking at a more domestically oriented approach is how the US looks at things, looks at the world, looks at trade, being proactive, looking to how ways, measures to avoid, mitigate, or recover the costs of these increased tariffs. And you have to consider not only the tariffs in place, but also, of course, what's anticipated in the future. Well, how do you do that? Here are a few ideas that I want to discuss for the next 5 or so minutes. If we could go to the next slide. First, what you want to do is avoid the tariffs altogether if possible. Tariff engineering is a concept you need to be completely at least cognizant of. These provide opportunities to maybe look for a different classification provision and declare them appropriately under that provision to your benefit. We found that a lot of companies weren't as focused on classification where it was a 0 or a 1% duty. Incomes of 15, 25%. Lo and behold, some companies find maybe they weren't classifying it properly. Maybe there's an opportunity there, or maybe they're getting questions from customs because there's more duty that needs to be paid. And customs could go back 5 years. Classification is the key. It is the core to any type of duty type situation. So you really have to make sure you're confident that your classification is correct and you are using the appropriate one. And it could work either way. It could work to your favor or against your favor, but you want to make sure you're doing it properly at the end of the day. It even can be impacted when we talk about tariff engineering based on the way the commodities come in. We've been increasingly getting questions from importers with machinery that's coming in for plants, for big manufacturing projects. What if the machinery is coming in, the different sub-assemblies or components on one container, or they're spread out over different containers, different shipments? You might have different classifications because you don't have the essential character, the full essence of that finished machine coming in together, but you have the various sub-assemblies and you'd classify it accordingly. That could really work in your favor if you just look at how you stage that cargo and you divide up, if you will, those bigger machines into different shipments. That's an example of tariff engineering. Origin engineering, a lot of you have become experts at it. You've looked at substantial transformation. What are the steps, the inputs, the change in manufacture that you could shift? It's all a question of shifting potentially away from China or that country that is now facing the high tariff, so you can enjoy the USMCA or the CUSMA program, for example, coming into the United States. That's been really key for companies who do have the option to move certain key manufacturing steps that confer origin to Southeast Asia, to South America, Latin America, to Canada, to escape, if you will, those tariffs. And that's going to become even more critical in this administration. There's always legislative, executive, and regulatory advocacy, advocating for those reductions in tariffs by way of miscellaneous tariff bills, which is kind of like a goodie bag of different types of parts, commodities, finished goods that Congress agrees can enjoy duty-free treatment. It is advocacy at its best or worst, depending on how you look at it, and looking for various agency rulemakings or legislative provisions that can help. The Section 301, as I mentioned, that's still alive and well. Currently, there are opportunities, 164 products covering 312 subheadings. A lot of them fall into the machinery or the technology provisions in 84 and 85. Those remain eligible for exclusions through May 2025, but those must be requested by the end of March. So that's a current opportunity if you're paying higher tariffs, particularly from China, on 84, 85 items. And coalitions that we like to work with and your associations like to work with to look at the exclusion process, look at the due process involved, look at if these exclusions, if you do get them, could be applied retroactively, which is so critical. Next slide, please. So as a quick example on the tariff engineering, turbine generators, they were wind power generating sets with a wind turbine and generating components classified at 2.5%. I believe that provision also had a China 301 duty. If unassembled, the rule is such that a complete article unassembled still is classified under the same heading as the assembled, as the finished article. So in this case, it was wind powered generating sets. However, in this case, as I kind of mentioned a minute ago, the components were able to be imported separately. They were classified either as electric motors and generators, excluding generator sets, and then they fell into 84.1290 free rate of duty. So just by importing them separately, there was a duty advantage and a Section 301 advantage. Next slide, please. The other one is origin, and a big origin issue has been motors. This is an example of electric stepper motor. It was a brushless synchronous motor that converts digital pulses into mechanical shaft rotation. The stamping of the steel slits would form coils, then they'd be pressed into stacks in Japan, China, and Vietnam. So the stacking would occur in Japan, China, and Vietnam. The pulley bearing shaft, the assembly, would occur in China, Thailand, or Vietnam, or in the third case in China as well. And if we go to the next slide, the way that these were stamped and pressed into the stator and rotor stack, that was determined to be the country of essential character. So in the first scenario, where the stator and rotor were manufactured in Japan by the stamping and the pressing, that became a country of origin Japan, despite the fact that there was subsequent production in China. In the second scenario, the stator and rotor, the steel slits were stamped in China from coils, then pressed into the stator and rotor stack in China. The wire was from Thailand, the bearing from China, the rest of the components from the other countries. Vietnam was where it was machined and painted. But again, Customs said, we're looking at the country where it's stamped, where it's stacked, where it's pressed, and that was China. The same happened in scenario 3. The stamping, the stacking, the pressing occurred in Vietnam. That was the country of origin, despite the fact that there was wire pulley shafts, bearings from China in that case. The point being, we spent a lot of time over the last few years just seeing if companies could move the stamping and the stacking, the pressing away from China to other countries so that they could enjoy a non-China country of origin and escape the 301. So you could really see how just moving that part of the operation, although there were subsequent assembly processes, could really be a game changer. Next slide, please. If you can't avoid the tariffs, you mitigate them. Valuation becomes really critical here, structuring your transactions to use the first as opposed to the second higher sale price, or reducing your payments or charges that don't relate to the production of the merchandise, so you don't have to include those. And I'm going to give you examples. Be aware of reconciliation and transfer pricing. There are opportunities there, especially if you understand that you typically adjust pricing lower than what would be declared based on your standards. If your actuals are going to go lower as a result, reconciliation is a way to flag. It's completely lawful to say, hey, this is my estimate. There are going to be changes. Or if you're making those transfer pricing adjustments, and Customs would be responsive to those changes, especially if they're lower, you want to take advantage of that. If they're going higher, you usually have an obligation to report those, however. Conducting those trade remedy reviews, the AD/CVD reviews, plywood, for example, the Chinese plywood that's been going through Vietnam, a lot of you might be familiar with those cases. It's time for a rate review. Companies can participate, but the importer has to work with those manufacturers, those exporters, those suppliers abroad to see if they can go in and get a lower rate. So those opportunities, if there's a new shipper who's involved, those, and maybe arguing your products out of scope, we do a lot of that, and that's a real opportunity. Leverage your automation, as I mentioned. Make sure that you have your payment systems in place so they're seamless, that you're using AI, leveraging it to take advantage of any opportunities that may be available as well, to avoid interest, to avoid higher payments than necessary. And there's always the idea of duty deferral, foreign trade zones, bonded warehouses, temporary importation bonds, in-bond movements where you're actually able to bring the merchandise in the United States. It doesn't have to go into the stream of commerce. It doesn't enter for consumption. It's going to be exported out or stored or held until perhaps maybe the tariff goes lower. Maybe you get that exclusion. Then you have that opportunity to enjoy that lower rate. In most cases, not all, it gets nuanced based on the timing of your entry from that warehouse, from that facility. But it's like a safe haven if you want to export or until you decide you want to import it and enter it. I should say just enter it into the US. Drawback also being a way to get those 99% of the duties back on the back end too, which is very critical. Next slides and just a few case studies, and then we'll go over to Colleen. This is how the first sale valuation works. In this case study, you have an importer, a vendor, let's say in Hong Kong, maybe 3 factories in China. So you have your second sale, your higher price that the importer pays to the vendor. First sale is going to be the vendor to those 3 factories or those manufacturers that would be in China, for example. Next slide, please. And in this case study, you could see the benefit right away. If you were looking at $10 million of entered value for that price that's usually being declared, $25 each a unit, you're going to understand that the price between the factory to the vendor is going to be less. It's going to be, let's say in this example, $25.25 each. As a result, with the 15% duty rate, that higher price sale, the one that you typically provide, it would give you $1.5 million in duties annually, but you would be saving $225,000 if you could use that second sale. We're looking for purchase orders between these two tiers, the importer and the vendor and the factory. Commercial invoices going back, factory vendor, vendor to importer. We're looking to show that when the merchandise was produced at the factory, it was clearly destined, it was marked for the United States. And a lot of companies, as a result, have saved hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars over the years in duties by just employing this type of first sale regime for value. Next slide, please. And these are the types of fees that I mentioned per HQ rulings, headquarters rulings from CBP, international freight charges, fuel surcharges, container yard, terminal handling fees, importer security filings, carrier agent bookings, construction fees. A lot of times we find these are included in the price of the goods. Importers are paying duties on them. It might seem like a small ticket item, but it builds up over time, especially in the high volume. You should be able to exclude these from your price and hence from the declared value for the merchandise. Next slide, please. And then let's not forget the bonded movements. These are some slides that you'll be receiving, the immediate transportation or for export or to move to another port. Very critical to understand these options. Container freight stations. This is just deconsolidating for import or export. So as a result, you're going to be able to, move those freely without paying duties. And then my final slides, next one. Bonded warehouses for 5 years, not paying duty until it's entered for consumption, or it's going to be necessarily exported, then you're good to go. In foreign trade zones where it's not just 5 years, it's in a limited time frame, and you are able to conduct manufacture, but there are limitations. If you're bringing in any types of components that are subject to AD/CVD or 301, those components would still need to typically be paying and charged with the duties. But at least your finished item, because you were able to conduct a lot of the heavy assembly, maybe the more costly manufacture, would not be subject. So you would escape that partially. So those are interesting options as well. And then finally, recovering tariffs, just keep in mind the litigation I mentioned. It's not too late to join. Like I said, it's currently before the appeals court at the federal circuit, which could create quite a windfall for those of you who have list 3 and 4A tariffs that you've been paying, and continue to take advantage of those protests, post-summary corrections when you see changes need to be made. So with that, I know I went over a little bit. I will send it back to Alan or Colleen, whoever's going to take over now, and I look forward to answering some of the questions. I see there are a few on de minimis, and I'd be happy to answer those at the end. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Lenny. Colleen, you're on.
All right, thank you. Well, thank you, Alan, and the team at GHY for inviting Lenny and I to present to you today. I'm going to be going over, you can move on to the next slide, the topic slide. The bond amount calculation for the U.S. Customs bonds, the insufficiency process, what stacking liability is or what aggregate liability is, informed compliance in bonds. The bond is required and it is the importer's responsibility to always have a sufficient bond on file with Customs. And then I'll go over underwriting. I think everybody's really interested in the underwriting piece, given the fact that we're going to foresee a lot of bond increases going forward. We can skip over the next slide and go on to the calculation. The general calculation that Customs has is 10% of the total duties, taxes, and fees paid over the last 12 months. When they review insufficiencies on a monthly basis, they go back 12 months. It's not based on the effective date of the bond. So there's always been some confusion of that. So keep in mind, they're looking at a rolling 12-month period. So it changes, that time frame changes every month that they review it. It's not based on the effective date of the bond. So it's $50,000 is the minimum minimum bond amount for bonds, for duties paid up to $1 million. It's increments of 10,000. So, if there's 600,000 in duty paid, then it goes to 60,000. Now, if you're paying more than $1 million in duty, it's in increments of 100,000. So if you pay 1.5 million in duty, you would need a $200,000 bond. It always is rounded up to the nearest 100. The amount of duty paid in the last 12 months includes anti-dumping, 201, 232, 301, and these new tariffs that will be eventually put in place. Next slide, please. Customs also has the analytical calculation where they're looking at that base amount of 10% of the duties, taxes, and fees paid, plus any outstanding bills, 10% of a supplemental duty bill if it's less than 210 days old or protested. If bills are not protested and or denied protest and greater than 210 days, they actually tack on dollar for those outstanding bills to that base bond amount. They also tack on dollar for unpaid debit vouchers, which are failed ACH payments to Customs. Next slide, please. I only have statistics through September. Customs provides them about every quarter for us. So we haven't received the year end yet because we're just into the new year. So if you look at this, the bond, as I explained before, the minimum bond amount is $50,000. That percentage of bonds at $50,000 is about 89%. It used to be 95 before 2018 when the original tariffs came into be. So if you look at this too, at that bottom line, the total outstanding liability for import bonds only is almost $28 billion. There's just, less than 10 sureties that actually write customs bonds in the US, a bulk of them. So if you look at that, the sureties that do write this business are on the hook for $28 billion, plus another $28 billion when each of these bonds renew, or if they're increased, of course, that number goes up. So I'll get into more detail on that as we go through the underwriting near the end. Next slide, please. Import bond sufficiency. So as I mentioned, Customs reviews sufficiency every month. They go back 12 months and look at the total duties, taxes, and fees paid or payable and determine what an importer's bond should be. So as I mentioned, 2018, when the original 301s and 232s came into be, there was a big increase in the number of insufficiencies that Customs sent out, with 2019 being the all-time high of over 13,000. It did decrease a little bit in 2020 because there was a time during the beginning of the pandemic where Customs relieved importers of having to increase their bonds for a 3-month period. So that was a lower year. But, you can see that they're, up to 10,000 in 22. It was reduced in 23, and then 24, that's only through September. So, by December, I'm sure we'll go up, a couple hundred more. Moving on. So how do you manage your sufficiency? Well, make sure you know that current bond formula. It's posted on Customs website, and that link, there is a link in this slide here. It's always, excuse me, 10% of the total duties, taxes, and fees for the last 12 months. But also forecast what you think you're going to pay in the next 12 months by applying, these expected tariff rates to the value of the goods that you will be importing that will be subject to those duties, and determine how big my bond should be, right? Informed compliance, it is an informed compliance. The bond is an informed compliance requirement, and having a sufficient bond is also. Surety, we have a saturation alert that we send to GHY, your broker, if there is a situation where an importer is getting close to being insufficient. So pay attention to those, and certainly don't wait. If your bond is coming up for renewal, make sure you're looking at it. It may be sufficient today, but will it be in 3 months? Moving forward, please. So how can you project it, and what are your resources? Well, your customs broker, GHY, you have the ABI data, the automated broker interface data, which has all that information in it as far as your duty payments are concerned. There's an ACE portal report, entry reports that will tell you you can run reports from ACE as long as you have a portal account. And sureties, we have what's called the automated surety interface, but it's just really summary data. We don't get classifications, we don't get tariff numbers, country of origins. So that data is just really header data. That's how we run our sufficiency reports. We don't have that granular data. So the best source of information really would be the customs broker, GHY. So moving next to the next slide. Tips, rule of thumb, always project the next 12 months. If you receive an insufficiency from CBP, they may say, oh, it's 50,000, it's going to 60,000, but look, do your own math and look at how much am I really going to pay, or forecasting what you will pay in the next 12 months. So you're not filing a 60, maybe you need $100,000 bond. So file it now. Otherwise, you may receive an insufficiency again in the next few months. Again, always remember to round up based on the calculation requirement. Next slide, please. Risks of insufficiency. So what happens if you fail to increase your bond timely? Well, if customs turns off your bond, you can't make entry. You'd have to get single transaction bonds. If it's grossly insufficient, meaning it's the amount of duty paid, or there's claims out there, that customs could immediately shut your bond off. And what does that cause? Demurrage charges. You have entries that came over the border and into the U.S. and you have to put it in storage. There's all of those issues related to the ability to release your goods. You could have stacking liability. If you have multiple issues with failing to really project correctly, there could be multiple insufficiency letters that go out to you. And then, of course, the underwriting scrutiny. Once you have this aggregate liability, it's more risk for the surety as well. Moving on. And how to avoid, again, project. Review at least 45 to 60 days prior to your bond renewal, because if you need a bond that does require additional underwriting, it's best to let us know ahead of time so that we can get that approved timely, so that we can terminate and replace the bond at your renewal time. Ensure you're really projecting the next 12 months. I keep saying that, but you really have to. Even if customs says one thing and you'll probably pay more, make sure you're going for that higher amount. The surety's liability doubles at bond renewal. So it's because of the liquidation cycle, it takes a year to liquidate, right? So that's what the surety looks at. We're looking at that double of a risk with aggregate stacking liability. The exposure is based on all open entries, plus that reliquidation time frame, that 90-day time frame. So you could have entries that stay open for years and the surety is still liable for that, as well as the principal. So that's what they're looking at as far as aggregate liability. Next slide. Informed compliance and surety underwriting. So I have this image of the CBP 301 bond, and it's not this form anymore. I mean, there is this form available, but it's an electronic bond. It's been an electronic bond. We just passed the 10-year anniversary of Customs e-bond. We worked since the 80s on that with Customs, and we finally got it 10 years ago. What do I mean by the gold standard? The U.S. Customs bond system, and we've been saying this for years, is really held out to the world as the gold standard, allowing customs authorities to release goods immediately to meet the needs of needs of commerce, while separating that revenue related factor. You can pay duties later. You get your release today, but that bond guarantees that the duties will be paid at some other time, as well as admissibility issues. You have redelivery for FDA. Those goods are gone and sold. So if there's a redelivery issue, that would come later, and the bond guarantees that would be handled. Next slide, please. So I pulled this from the Informed Compliance publication for entry, and it does actually state in there all the agreements that the bond covers, the conditions that are covered, so to pay your duties, taxes, and fees, make entry, produce documents, redeliver, rectify any admissibility issues, and so on. Next slide. And based on all this, why does a surety underwrite? Well, it is a contractual obligation. It's not insurance. It's a contract, right? So the importer and the surety have joint and several liability and agree to all of those agreements on the previous slide. They both have that responsibility. If the importer fails, then the surety has to step in their shoes to handle that claim. So that's the main reason for underwriting. It's a financial guarantee, whether it be 50,000 or 20 million, that surety is on the hook for that amount, and double when those bonds renew. Our historical losses, I just got the report the other day of our 2024 losses. The highest loss category is classification change. So that's very important to make sure you're classifying your goods properly, so you don't have a bill, that comes out at liquidation. Anti-dumping has always been a huge loss factor for sureties, and most require collateral. We did see an uptick in non-payment of estimated duties, including debit vouchers, which is a failed ACH payment. So those are considered when we look at underwriting. Market capacity, that a previous slide that showed almost $28 billion in outstanding liability for all import bonds on file, continuous import bonds. Sureties look at that. We write about 30%, 35% of the bonds. So when you look at that amount, you're thinking, holy cow, that's a lot of liability the surety has. Sureties buy reinsurance to protect them from catastrophic losses. So when a surety underwrites, they have to be sure that they're protecting the surety from having to buy more reinsurance or those catastrophic losses. The liquidation time frame is a factor with stacking and aggregate liability, and statute of limitations too. Next slide, please. Other conditions. Well, the CBP enforcement actions, these tariffs, right? So we're looking at that. All these bonds are going to increase exponentially if this happens. Forced labor issues. Well, we haven't received any redelivery claims for forced labor. That is always in the back of our mind. because if there's goods that are released and customs suspects that they're forced labor goods, they could come back and require redelivery. So that's a liquidated damage claim. Economic issues, we talk about the pandemic and the hangover of the pandemic and the difficulties many companies had with their financials and the inflation, right? The inflation factor as well. Liquidated damages in those supplemental duty bills. Customs, it can take a long time for customs to issue these claims. We're seeing that more and more. And of course, supplemental duty bills, they occur at liquidation. So those come, a year after entry, typically, or longer if the entry is extended. Next slide. Financial review. So if a financial is requested, and they're really only requested for bonds as they get up to into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Bonds less than $100,000 are pretty not freely written, but they're not as scrutinized as the larger bonds, obviously, because it is a financial guarantee. Audited financials are best. Surety underwriters do look at other financial statements, internal compilations and reviews as well. But obviously an audited financial statement is done by a third-party auditing firm, or accounting firm. So those are really the best source of financial information. I always say cash is king. The surety underwriters look at that, at the cash, the amount of cash and the cash flow to make sure that there's enough there for payment of the duty and all of their other obligations, right? Accounts payable. Net working capital, that is the current assets minus the current liabilities. That kind of measures the liquidity and their ability to fund their operations and stay in business. Net worth is their value, right? That's the value of a particular company. Profitability, they really look at profitability in their income statement to make sure that the company is making money because that will decrease their net worth over time if there are multiple years of losses. Bank loans, usually in an audited statement, it has notes and it will tell you the amount of outstanding lines of credit and what the interest rate is. The interest rate is a big factor when the underwriters look at a financial statement, because if a bank has a very high interest rate on some loans or lines of credit for a company, they really look at that because that's kind of an indication of their ability to obtain credit when it's a higher interest rate. We also look at third-party financials. If there's a parent company or a related company to an importer, we'll definitely look at those for indemnification purposes. And collateral, sometimes collateral is required, not as often as people think, but sometimes it is required, and depending on the history of that importer, it may be required at renewal as well. Next slide. Other factors, we look at the bond amount, right? Because it is a financial guarantee, and the aggregate liability, which includes all terms of an open bond. When I say open bond, that means there's open entries. Entries have not yet liquidated. There are claims issues, maybe. That is always reviewed. How much of exposure is for that one principal. Credit rating, there's Dun & Bradstreet as well as Standard & Poor's. Commodity and entry type, as I mentioned, anti-dumping is always a very high loss ratio for surety companies. So we look at that. If there are a lot of O3 entries for an importer, that's scrutinized a little bit closer. Duty rate, we're talking about tariffs. So, what are you paying today? What could you be paying tomorrow? That is a factor. Their liquidation history. A lot of times we see customs for some reason they'll extend entries, which is the O1 extension, because maybe they didn't have time to review to make sure all the proper duty was paid, or there's anti-dumping or some other reason. So that is reviewed, the liquidation history of an importer. Claims history, if there's been liquidated damage claims, in particular non-payment of duty, that's a big red flag for a for a surety company. Next slide. In the end, sureties are in business to write bonds, right? Not decline them. So there is a common sense approach, subjective underwriting, I call it, where they're looking at a particular bond. You know, we've been in the writing bonds. Roanoke's been around since 1935. It's our 90th year. So we do have a lot of history. A lot of the bonds that we write, we've written for 20, 30, 40 years. So we have that information. We look at that history. We look at the broker, GHY, great track record, the loss ratio of a broker. And then again, it's a subjective review. If it's a low risk commodity coming in versus a kind of a financial condition that may be not so great when an underwriter looks at it, well, we do make exceptions based on the history. And I do believe that's my last slide. Yes. Just in time for a couple questions.
Indeed. Thank you, Colleen. Okay, we will jump into the Q&A and chat areas. And Lenny, Al, Colleen, if you want to turn on your mics and videos, we'll get going here. So let's go with, I'm just going to go with some that came in right at the beginning here. So from Danny, what is the difference between section 338 and section 201?
Sure. The section 201, as I mentioned, is going to be limited to specific products, right? So right now, 201's in play, and that's been for washing machines and for solar cells. So it is specific to those duties, are specific to those products. For the 338, it's a different type of situation, because when you have 338, this is really going to be a country-specific tariff that can go up to 15% and potentially ban imports of that country pretty much all together, if in fact it appears that the U.S. is being discriminated against in trade. So think of 201 as commodity-specific tariffs and targeted in that way. But the 338 are tariffs that are going to be targeted to particular countries.
Thanks. I see two other questions, maybe common themes. One was, is there any strategy people should be looking at, and what is the likelihood of the tariffs and what type of tariff coming in? I don't think any of us have a crystal ball, Lenny, and I think you've covered that well in your slide, but do you recommend any particular strategy to assist in that regard, and address that one and maybe broadly de minimis, and then we'll wrap it if that's okay.
Okay, so as far as strategies go, I provided, some of those different factors to consider. If I'm going to leave you with one, I'd say please really take a careful look at your classification. Your classification is going to make or break duties. It's something that Colleen and Roanoke are going to be interested in. Are you classifying properly? Because that's going to guide to how these tariffs are going to have to be, if not country specific, more likely tariff specific. So having the right tariff is key. And if it's wrong, Colleen and I could tell you the war stories of then having to go back 5 years and pay duties. So that's not fun, right? So if there's one thing I would leave it with, it's that. If it's a second thing, I'd say look at value. Look how you're valuing your merchandise. Is it appropriate, or are there opportunities you're missing to lower it? Finally, on de minimis, I know there are a few questions on that, Alan, and you kind of threw that in there. I'm gonna go for this group. Are you ready for this? I'm gonna say there's a better than 50% chance. I'm gonna go with 60%. I'm often a 50-50 guy, I'm sorry, but I'm gonna go 60% for this group. 60% chance we will see a de minimis rulemaking in the next week or two before the administration changes over. It seems like the winds are blowing in that direction. And that means not necessarily that you're no longer going to be able to do de minimis for the 301 China when that rule comes out, but the wheels are going to start turning, at least on the procedural part, the entry of low value shipments, with the 301 piece falling behind. If de minimis is part of your business model, you have to take a very serious, careful look. There are going to be bond implications, right, Colleen? Because although you don't need a bond for de minimis, you're going to need them if you're going to have to pay tariffs on them. And you're going to need an importer, right, Colleen? So we've been talking a lot about that. That is going to be a huge game changer for companies. Who's going to be the importer? So if
Right.
that's part of your business model, or you got to really be ready for plan B, which is paying the tariffs, getting a bond, having an importer responsible party. And I will tell you this, if we come back a year from now, de minimis is not going to look the same. I'd be very surprised if de minimis here in January 2025 is going to look the same as it will in January 2026. Can't tell you exactly how it's going to be different, but it's going to be different.
Well, we're at the 11 o'clock mark. We want to thank you both for your experience and look forward to potentially future webinars. We will take whatever questions and get back to people after the fact. Thank you for your experience. Thank you for participating, and thanks everybody for being on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Have a great day, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.